this video we'll give you some information on how to field judge mule deer. So come along with us as we go into this video looking at winter range mule deer and learn about field judging mule deer. You know, over the last 40 years, I developed a system to field judge trophy mule deer. Today, we're going to talk about how to use the system to look at a buck and rack bracketing. In other words, is a buck a 150 class mule deer, 160, 170, or maybe a 180? Now, we're not going to be worried about a 200 mainframe or a 190 mainframe Boone and Crockett mule deer because, quite frankly, most of us, if we see a buck like that, we don't care about how he really rack brackets other than he's a huge mule deer. But most of our reality is bucks in the 180s down to the 150s. So we're going to concentrate on how to rack bracket those type of mule deer. I want you to remember that there's basically three structures of typical mule deer racks, and we'll be talking about them in this segment. Okay, like I've said, there's three types of typical mule deer racks. And when you field judge, the first thing you do is look at that mule deer and determine which one of the three. Now there's variations to these three types of racks, but there's only basically three racks. They are, number one is a buck that has good fronts, bad backs. And what that means is, you notice this buck here, when you measure a mule deer, you measure, this is called the G2, and it comes from here and you measure right up to here. Then the second point is a G3 and you measure from here right to where it branches. You notice this buck here, he branches quite high right here. If he had branched right down here, you would have cut that much more of a measurement on this particular point. So this buck also has pretty decent fronts. You notice here his G4 right here is almost as high as these back tangs. And then of course right here is called the main beam that comes right around like this. That makes up the typical rack of a mule deer. This buck has good fronts, bad backs. That's the first type of trophy mule deer rack. Good fronts, bad backs. The second type is one that has good backs but short fronts. The third type of rack is a buck that has good fronts and also good backs. He has no outstanding feature to his rack. Now this is the toughest one to judge because of that reason. Now you notice this buck, he branches pretty good in the back and he's got a real good main beams and his G4 is almost as long as these back tangs. That's the third type of typical rack that a mule deer will have. Now they will vary a little between these three types, but that's the three types of mule deer racks. Now I want to tell you 65% of the total score of a mule deer comes from his fronts. And what I mean by his fronts is his main beam, his G4 right here, and the inside spread. That's where 65% of a mule deer score will come from. If you can find a buck that's got good fronts, even though he's got bad backs, he will score better than a buck that has good backs and short fronts because of that reason. So remember that when you're looking at a trophy mule deer, you look at his rack. If he's got good fronts and bad backs, he'll score better than a buck that's got real long back tangs and has a short main beam and has usually a short inside spread, because the inside spread is the only spread that you can use. Now, I've had a lot of guys, their benchmark for a heavy mule deer is 22 inches of total mass on a side. Now, how they score that is they measure between here and the burr. That's the first circumference. The second one is between the burr and right here. The third one is right between here and here. And the fourth one is between here and here. And that's the four circumferences of a mule deer, and if that totals up to over 20 inches of mass, you got a real heavy trophy mule deer. When you're looking at mule deer in different areas where you're hunting mule deer, that's the first consideration I give as to what type of mule deer. Are they big-headed or medium-sized headed mule deer? Because that will help you determine inside spread and also outside rack-to-rack spread. I use the ears to determine how long the main beam is. And what you do, that takes a little bit of practice. I figure if a buck has got 2.5 ears of main beam here, his main beam is over 24 inches. Now that doesn't really calculate right because their ears are longer than that, but when you're sitting there with a spotting scope and looking at a buck maybe that's 400 or 500 yards away, it really kind of comes out to that. That gives you that extra inch or two to play with. So just remember that. If he's only 2 ears long, his main beams, they're under 23 inches. If they're 2.5 inches long, by just going boonk, 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 he's over 24 inches on his main beams. And then again, like I said, the first thing you look at in a trophy mule deer is his fronts, because 65% of his total score comes from his main beam, his inside spread, and his G4. And the second thing I look at is how well he branches in the back. The third thing, I see if he's got eye guards. The fourth thing is what kind of mass he has. You know, over the past 35 years, I developed this system to field judge and rack bracket mule deer. This isn't a system to give you the total net score or to give you exactly what this buck scores. What it's meant to do is give you an idea the rack size of that buck, whether he's a 150 class mule deer, a 170, or like this buck here, a 180. That's all I want to know. Right then, out in the field, is what kind of buck I'm looking at, gross score. And I hope this will help you. It's helped me over the years by using this system, and I'm sure if you get proficient with it, it'll help you be a better trophy hunter. One thing to realize when you're judging trophy mule deer, it's impossible to judge a mule deer from the side. Look at this buck with his head laying there sleeping. Now, I went around and videoed the buck from the front. He's the top one right there. Look at that. That is the same buck as the one you looked at from the side. So you can't look at a buck from the side and get a good view of a trophy mule deer. Like this buck here. This buck looks like just a deer, but wait until he turns and looks straight on to you. Look at that. He has a 27-inch inside spread and 26-inch main beams. You got to look at a trophy mule deer from the front to be able to tell how good a rack he has when you're judging mule deer in the field. This buck here is a 160 type mule deer. You notice here his rack is on the inside of his ears. He's a good little 4-point, but what you're looking for if you're looking for a good trophy mule deer is a 170 or above. Now this next buck right here is 170. Notice his inside spread is 24 inches. His ears are inside his rack. He's got good back tangs. Now the next buck that's next to him is a 160. And you can tell the difference right here. This is the 160 buck and the 170 is in front. One thing to remember is when they run away, they pinch their ears back and their spread looks twice as big and makes the buck look 3 times as big as he is. Never, I repeat, never field judge a mule deer from behind because he's always got his ears cocked back to listen to you as he's running away. Now this is a good example of a 160 and a 170 mule deer. The 170 right here as he pops his head up, look at the 160 to the left here. He has a good rack, he has the same size back tangs, but his ears are outside of his main beam. Now, here's a good example of a 170 on the left and a 180 on the right. The only difference between these two bucks is the 170 buck has short main beams and short G4s. Look at the G4s and main beam on the 180. They're a lot longer, and that's why he's a 180 and the buck to the left is a 170. They both got the same length back tangs. It's the fronts that makes a difference on these two mule deer. Now this is a 180 mule deer. Now notice on this mule deer he has 24-inch main beams. Now look at the 190 on the right. You notice that his inside spread is probably 26 inches. He's got a 26-inch main beam. That's the difference between a 180 and a 190 mule deer. It's almost like night and day. To get a 190, you're jumping up to a buck that just looks huge. They both have the same back tangs. It's just the main beams and the fronts that are different. Now this buck here is a low 190 gross. Now let's look at a 160 buck and tell the difference between the two of them. The one on the right here is going to be a 160 class mule deer. Can you see the difference? The 160, his rack is inside his ears, and the 190 is so much bigger. He has bigger back tangs, his main beams are bigger, his rack is on the outside of his ears by 2.5 inches on both sides. That's the difference between a 160 and a 190 mule deer. Using the ears to indicate the rack size is the way to really tell a buck when you're rack bracketing a mule deer in the field. Now, here's the 190 again, and here's what a 170 looks like. Proportionally, the 170 has a good rack, but notice again that his ears are on the outside of his rack where the 190 is on the inside. And look at the 170. The 170 has as good a back tangs as a 190, but then again, look at his front. His main beams are really short and his G-force short.